Welcome back, fellow time travelers. This time, the flux capacitor sent us back to May of 1985, as we take a look at the Morrow Pivot 2, a portable computer from a time when laptops had yet to reach their final form. The box itself is small and unassuming, but sliding the two releases on the top allows the keyboard to fold down, and that's where the magic really happens. Designed by Norman Towson and Michael Stolowitz, it features an Intel-compatible 8088 processor clocked at 5 MHz, paired with up to 640 KB of RAM and dual 5¼ floppy drives. The base model, which had a single floppy drive and 256 KB of RAM, had a retail price of $2,995 US. But mine is the middle tier version, which includes both floppy drives but still only 256 KB of memory, which sold for $3,795, which is over $7,500 in today's money. A friend of mine had been holding onto this for quite a while, and when he decided to part with it, I decided to add it to my collection. Thanks, Tim. Morrow licensed the Pivot design to a few companies, most notably Zenith, who paid $1.2 million for the rights instead of a per-unit deal. This would come back to haunt Morrow, as Zenith would go on to sign a $27 million contract with the IRS to supply portables, which might have kept Morrow out of bankruptcy if only they'd gotten a little bit more out of it. While this design isn't super practical for sitting on someone's lap, it makes perfect sense when you're going from your desk at the office to your desk at home. To make that even easier, it comes with a snazzy little strap that you can snap onto the sides of the unit and carry it wherever you need to go. At 13 pounds, it isn't exactly light, but it's perfectly manageable for some computing on the go. One neat thing the Pivot 2 has going for it is its inclusion of 32 KB of ROM, which gives it a few tricks right out of the box, no software required. Turning it on, and after performing a memory test, brings us to a world map with a calendar and clock. And that's not all. Hiding in ROM is an integrated terminal app that can make use of the Pivot's integrated 1200 baud modem. And it also has a rudimentary calculator built right in, which is decent enough. My only complaint would be that it just uses the keyboard numpad layout instead of the numbers on the top of the keyboard. I find this a little hard to get used to, and it also leaves numlock on if you boot into DOS after launching the calculator, but not bad for instantly available on power on. The screen on the Pivot 2 has a resolution of 640 by 200, which allows for a display of up to 25 lines of text, very similar to the IBM PC compatible we took a look at last year. But while the resolution might be the same, the backlight on the Pivot makes a night and day difference. Literally. The setup screen on the Pivot is pretty sparse, but it allows you to set up the features you'd expect. Date, time, as well as time zone, modem and printer settings, and whether or not the unit boots to DOS on startup. Now, my unit is in need of a pretty good clean refurbishment, but I haven't found a lot of source material that covers the Pivot's insides, so I thought it was a good idea to do this video first, just in case. Well, before we get to using it, let's give the machine itself a look over. The keyboard is decent with a respectable amount of key travel, although it's not my favorite. The keys themselves are decent enough to type on, but the function keys use a membrane-style key instead, which is mushy and has never been my favorite solution. It's okay, but nothing to write home about. On the right-hand side of the unit, we have two side-by-side, on their side, 360 KB 5¼ floppy drives, and this was arguably one of the Pivot's biggest selling points. Many portable machines were using 3¼ floppy drives in order to save space, while desktop machines still primarily used 5¼ which, of course, made transferring data between the two of them problematic. But the Pivot forgoes these troubles by sticking with what was, at the time, the preferred format for desktops, ensuring interchangeability. On the left, we find the power switch, power jack, a dial to adjust the contrast on the screen, and a removable battery pack that allowed for on-the-go computing when plugging in wasn't an option. The battery used was apparently a camcorder battery, but I haven't been able to find a replacement, and this one died long ago. Around back, we see a 25-pin serial connector, a 25-pin parallel connector, and a couple of RG11 connections for the internal modem. There's also an expansion bus that looks suspiciously similar to an 8-bit ISA slot, but I haven't found anything that confirms that to be the case. Also notably empty are the holes for the 9-pin CGA and composite video output, as this machine lacks the required external video card. Removing the rather large door in the back of the unit, which just slides away with a bit of pressure, we get a look at the RAM module as well as the rest of the internals. The RAM is connected to some very long header pins, which, to be honest, feels fairly weak. But it's worked this long, so who am I to judge? Removing the RAM, we get a better look at the motherboard for the pivot, and even though the rest of the case is pretty dirty, the electronics still look pretty clean. I guess that's one advantage to having nothing to move air inside the case. There's the Oki M80C88 processor that powers the whole operation. And various other chips in here have dates in the later half of 1985, so it looks like this unit was assembled a few months after it went on sale. And even though I don't love how the memory module attaches, I still love how easy they made it to upgrade. Okay, enough gushing over the insides, let's see what it can do. Unfortunately, the amount of software I had that would fit onto a 360 kilobyte floppy is a bit limited at the moment, so we're going to have to resort to games once again. As I worked on this video, the floppy drives unfortunately began to deteriorate, with a clunk that sounded like resetting the head position after each sector was read. I had hoped that it was just a matter of using disks that were formatted on a different drive with a slightly different head alignment, but even disks formatted on the pivot exhibited this issue. So yeah, this machine's heading towards a full teardown next, but for now, let's see what we can get running. I started with a disc of shareware and freeware games that was handed out at a computer club meeting during Christmas in the 80s. The first title was Pitfall, which, surprisingly, was not a clone of the Atari game by the same name. Instead, it's one of those games where it generates a random cavern, and your goal is to navigate your ship through without hitting the walls or the enemies. To be honest, the screen surprised me with how well it worked on this one. The amount of ghosting on the display is far lower than I was expecting. It does show that same line dividing the upper and lower section of the panels that we last saw on the AST46 laptop from a few years ago, but it's perfectly playable. Next, Kong, or David's Kong, ended up being a pretty passable clone of Donkey Kong, which works really well on this black and white display. My only complaint is that you can't hold the cursor keys. Each movement has to be its own tap, so you end up frantically tapping the keys to go up ladders. Also, I didn't realize that level 2 starts right where level 1 leaves off, and I immediately fell off the platform. Still, this is a pretty well put together game, and it's cool to find it hiding on a disc after all these years. Good job, David. The Breakout clone did not like this display, so there is gameplay happening somewhere, but we don't get to see it. Chopper Commando made it as far as the title screen but would progress no further, which is a shame because it really is an awesome game. I also tried 3D Pool by Microplay Software, which was released in 1990. I had little hope of it working, and it didn't surprise. Oh well. Centipede worked pretty well on here, although I found it hard to keep track of the gray colored ship. Finally, since I was able to get it working on the convertible, I decided to try Leisure Suit Larry. And while I did get the rather promising question about configuring the joystick, the machine ultimately froze. Software like QBasic also complained about a lack of memory, which makes sense. At less than half the memory of the convertible, it is severely lacking. Hopefully one day I'll find a memory upgrade, and after almost 40 years, it will be able to finally live up to its potential. On March 11th, 1986, with millions of dollars in debt to its name, Morrow Designs filed for bankruptcy, taking with it plans to release the Pivot XT, which would have brought an internal hard drive and 3.5-inch floppy drive to the Pivot ecosystem. But alas, it was not meant to be, and Morrow is now only a rather interesting footnote in the history of luggable computers. Hey, thanks so much for hanging around with me and taking a look back at this old machine. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. Take care, and I'll see you in the next one.